Thanks very much, John. And it's really lovely to be here. And it's lovely to read with Rachel and Vu. And, so I'm going to read, because it's featuring fiction writers tonight here at U Chicago, I'm going to read something from my first book. I've been sort of touring and reading from my from a memoir that just came out a couple months ago, and it's sort of time to take a little break from that and read a story. So this is from Power Ballads. John, I really love to hear you say Power Ballads. It's a it's a special treat to hear those two words come out of your mouth. And it's a story called Beginners. My father was never happy in work. His one great glory came when I was 14, about the time I started playing jazz seriously. He was a shift manager at a fancy resort hotel. He wore a mustache then, dyed and combed, and a pale yellow polo. And he wandered the carpeted halls of the complex with great purpose, straightening pictures, rearranging the continental breakfast, and playing grab-ass with the maids. Somehow, he lasted almost 3 years. They hated to let him go. Without being able to actually say what he did around the place, everyone seemed to love him. A decade later, I had my first respectable gig with the Charles Rigby Quintet. I was starting to play all around the city, starting to figure out how to make it pay. My father was living out in Florence, Oregon, where he worked as a load picker in a Costco, heaving around cases of frozen fish sticks, throwing himself into it like one of the boys. At 52, his essential directionlessness had stranded him in cold storage. In this regard, direction, unswerving direction, our two separate lives had become nothing if not counterpoint. So tell me, he said, how's the musician's life? We talked every 2 weeks, noon on a Sunday, faithful to a schedule, if nothing else. Well, I said, the Rigby group is gearing up to tour. Charles is finalizing the dates for Europe. Europe? The grand tour, huh? That's fantastic, really fantastic. Jesus, the kid is going to Europe. Mom would be over the moon, Timmy. You know she would. Why couldn't he just say he was proud of me? Why did he have to summon up the specter of a woman I barely remembered? How's the deep freeze treating you? I said. He hesitated. He didn't love talking about his work. The idea that one occupation defined a person never seemed to adhere to him. Just think warm, he said. That's what I tell myself. Just think Bermuda, Hawaii. Can't daydream too much, though, all the activity flying around that warehouse. Actually, he said, taking on a hopeful tone, I've been hunting up new opportunities. They say things are really happening with this day trading thing. Well, that's great, Dad, I said. Good luck with that. I tried to sound like I meant it, and then failing, tried to joke. You always seem to have beginner's luck, I said. My father trusted in a world where a good man, a well-meaning man, could luck into a good, well-paying job. He still believed in being in the right place at the right time. After I went off to music school, he sold the house I grew up in and followed a girlfriend. She left him soon enough, out to the Pacific Northwest, seduced by the notion of sucking himself to the sleek and ravenous computer industry like a remora to a shark. While I was studying the sacred rhythms of the Yoruba, he was busy speculating on domain names in the great stampede of the late 90s. He had a winner with beaniebabies.com, but softmicro.com and the United States of America.net never brought in the lucre. By the time I was old enough to make my pilgrimages to the Blue Note, the Vanguard, and Smalls Club, he was driving an Econoline van around the Pacific Northwest, selling artisanal memorials and headstones. He argued the catalog stuff was too impersonal. Just after I graduated, he started recruiting college kids to be exterminators. He traded the van for VW custom painted with a termite on the hood and the words, high-paying summer jobs. I came to Chicago just before the towers fell in New York. Chicago was where the cutting-edge stuff, the truly out shit, was happening, where they were mixing up free jazz with indie rock, Middle Eastern rhythms, chamber music, and whatever thumping chaos a computer could emit. New York felt like a closed shop, and I couldn't stomach the rent anyway. On the morning of the attacks, Dad called me, sick with fear. He needed reassurance. "You're not living near any tall buildings, are you?" he said. At the time, I was living out of my practice space in the West Loop, but was loath to confess it to him. Dad was convinced the Sears Tower and Hancock Building were next. "Better get out of there for a few weeks, Tim," he said. "Come out here and stay with me." I didn't bite. When the smoke cleared, he would realize the idea of my escaping to the rainy Northwest was ludicrous. And even if it wasn't, I also blamed him for leaving me without a home to go back to, for unmooring us both, for trying to start a new life for himself and failing. "You could get yourself set up in no time," he said that September afternoon. Hearing that he wouldn't even get a couple weeks out of me, he gallantly tried for more, a permanent reunion. "I hear they got a great music scene up in Seattle," he said. He was a few years behind the times, but I didn't correct him. On the TV, the second tower was falling. "I know, Dad," I said. "It's really happening out there." "What's the latest from the bandstand?" he said. "Not much. SOS, same old shit." For once on the phone, I didn't want to talk music. Charles Rigby had fucked me over. He'd hired a bunch of German guys as sidemen, cheaper for him, for the European tour. There I was, thinking I was on the cusp, about to be recognized as one of the cats, and now I was just disposable. I wanted to lick my wounds, but I had to spend my Sunday teaching lessons, showing suburban brats how to bash along to Corrosion of Conformity and Godsmack. "What's the weather on your end?" I said. "Well, you get more sunny days than you think." "Well, who needs a vacation, right?" "Exactly." My father laughed, but I wouldn't have said it was funny. "You're right, though," he said. "Most days it's gray as the afterlife out here. Anyway, I'd better go. Got to catch a quick cat nap. They put me on second shift." "Well," I said, "stay warm." The phrase that back home in the frozen north passed for both goodwill and goodbye. I was trying to teach Brandon, my best student, four-limb independence. "Oh, this is jazz stuff," he said, throwing down his sticks in frustration. "What's the point of any of this?" I asked him, patiently, if he'd heard Black Sabbath. "Yeah, bro," he said. "They're like the source for everything heavy." "Well, all those cats came up on jazz. Django, Count Basie, Gene Krupa. Hell, the first Sabbath lineup had a guy playing tenor sax." "Here," I said, sitting down behind the kit and playing the first fill from War Pigs. "That's Bill Ward, and this, the intro to the first cut on Caravan, is Art Blakey. What's the difference? The difference is Bill Ward tippy-tapped the drums, and Blakey hit them." Brandon scowled, telling me this was all deeply uncool. On my way to that night's gig, my phone vibrated in my pocket. "Dad," the readout said, and I let it go to voicemail. Then something told me to check my messages. It wasn't my father, but an unfamiliar, official-sounding voice explaining that my name was at the top of Dad's call history, saying there'd been an accident at the warehouse. I arrived from the airport just at the end of visiting hours. They set me up on a cot in Dad's room. He'd grown his mustache back out, gray now, of course, along with a beard. His hair was shaggy, and it sat on his head strangely, like a wig. "You look like you're in disguise, Dad," I said when the night nurse woke him to tell him I was there. "Like you're headed out for the Arctic." He smiled distantly, like someone searching for a memory. "What?" I said. "You thought I wouldn't come?" They'd laid him out with some serious pain medication, and he was delirious. "Grape juice," he said, wetting his lips to push the words out. "Goddamn frozen grape juice." What happened, I learned, was that the shift manager at the loading bay had sent him deep into the high stacks of an arriving load to pluck out a case of juice concentrate. Someone had stacked the pallet badly, and half the order toppled. A younger man with swifter reactions would have dodged. My father took it between his shoulders. Right place, right time. I slept deeply next to him. Bless the silence of that hospital wing. I didn't get much silence in my life. But in the middle of the night, I woke, aware of someone watching me. Dad sat on the edge of his bed in a gown that came to mid-thigh. His hands clutched the edge of the bed, his knuckles chapped and bruised, all that work in the freezer, like he'd just gone a few rounds. "Beginner's luck, huh?" he said, looking so intently at me, I thought he must be seeing something else. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? "Hey, Pop," I said, "come on, you're high out of your mind." "What's it mean?" "Well, you got a lot of enthusiasm," I said. "You make friends easy. People like you, I guess." "How do you live?" He strained forward like he was going to grab me, then suddenly sprang upright, seized by a spasming back. "How do you live?" he said again when I'd settled him down. "How do you live without any constants?" "Any what?" I said. "I can't start from scratch again. I can't. What are we doing here? Come on, let's get out of this place." He started up again, but I gently pushed him back down. "You want another shot?" I said. "I can call them for another little shot of the good stuff." "Mom's here," he said matter-of-factly. "Can't you feel her? She just came in." "I know, Dad," I said, placating him. "She's right here beside me." I thought to get the night nurse, but then I just sat there sort of rubbing and petting his hand. Finally, I held his hand. I don't know how long. Long enough for the world to shrink to just that one room, the fog curling past the window one horizon, the dark hallway with its faint green glow the other. My mom. I suppose if she was anywhere that night, except under the ground, she was there with us, dancing between the vapor of my father's breath and my own, born up again, if only for a last few minutes. In the morning, Dad was more himself again, flirting with the nurses, play-acting the stoic but enfeebled old man giving himself into their tender care. A doctor wearing Converse All-Stars blew in and described some beautiful things: physical therapy, deep tissue massage, acupuncture. "You'll have discomfort from here on," he said, "so I want us all to think about the ways we can manage your discomfort." Dad just grunted. I could already see the big tub of icy hot coming out to live again on his bedside table. When I was little, Dad liked to dab it on the tip of my nose. "Icy, then hot," he'd say. "Icy, then hot," while I giggled uncontrollably. When visiting hours started, his coworkers began filing in. He had plenty of work buddies, 4 months on the job, and he was already like a mascot to them. The shift manager showed around noon. "We hate seeing these kinds of accidents," he kept saying. "We just hate them." This man, I understood, was the company's messenger. You could smell the Freon coming off him. He asked Dad 100 little questions. "How's the food? You got enough pillows? What do you think you'll do? Why don't you take a few weeks? Take your time, rest up, don't go pushing yourself too hard." Dad turned to me, a helpless look on his face. "Have you met my son?" he said to his manager. "He's one of the best jazz drummers in the country." "Oh, come on now, Dad," I protested in my modesty. "You like jazz?" Dad asked his boss. Sure, yeah," the shift manager said uneasily. "All that jazz." My phone vibrated in my pocket. The display listed a long, strangely formatted number. Europe. I hesitated. "Whoops," I said on the first ring. "Gotta take this." I went out in the hall. It was Charles Rigby telling me that Ernst, the Bavarian drummer he'd hired to replace me, couldn't swing for shit. "Mr. Tim," Charles said in that legendary, raspy voice, "get your white ass over here." "All right, Charles," I said. Sounds good. Listen, I'll talk to you soon." I snapped the phone shut on him mid-sentence. "They've been in meetings all morning," the shift manager was telling Dad when I came back in. "They're taking this thing seriously. I mean, you've really got them on the ropes." Dad hardly seemed to be listening to him. "You'll have discomfort, sure," the shift manager said, "but this is the kind of thing, well, you'll never have to work another day in your life." Dad set his jaw, trying to harden himself. But I was there to see, the instant it began, the rot setting in. Over the 2 years he had left, He must have started 20 different armchair hobbies. Seagram's whiskey and Winston cigarettes were 2 of them, but they weren't the things that killed him. The nurses came in and kicked both me and the shift manager out so they could change the sheets and get Dad cleaned up. "I'll be right back, Pop," I called out. "I'm going to pick up some of your stuff." In the hallway, the shift manager shook my hand. "I'll look out for your name," he told me. I got directions to Dad's apartment on the outskirts of town. I was charged with picking up a change of clothes, some books and magazines, and a few other things to keep him distracted. As I drove through the misty streets of Florence, I couldn't help it. I did the math. If I got a flight out of PDX by early evening, I'd make it in time to meet Charles at the Dusseldorf Jazz Rally. It wouldn't even be a question of asking Dad's forgiveness. He, of all people, would understand. His apartment was tidy and small, exceptionally small. Dad had built shelves on almost every wall, and his rooms were filled with the fresh, astringent scent of bare pine. I went into the bedroom and picked out a couple flannel shirts. He didn't have anything other than work clothes. In the dresser, his underwear was ironed and perfectly folded. The man had time on his hands. I threw together an overnight bag as quickly as I could. I was rushing now. It was going to be a matter of minutes, not hours. But then, hurrying out, I stopped. Between a small library of sci-fi paperbacks, framed by them, as it were photos, certificates, ribbons, a little trophy of a tiny golden man wailing away on a saxophone. Tim Burton, the attached plaque read, "Outstanding soloist." He'd built a shrine to me, like he'd built one to my dead mother in the house I grew up in. A photo of me sitting up at a club, up close to the stage, watching Elvin Jones play, leaning over intently, studying his every move. Another photo of me unpacking my first drum set. A dumb teenage drawing of a concert, flames shooting up from the stage, and all the spotlights turned on me. What can be said about it? There was no time to linger. I felt embarrassed and shy to see that here, in this obscure corner of nowhere, I had already made it. Thanks, everyone.
That was such a pleasure to hear Will's story. John, thank you for the generous introduction, and thank you guys for coming. I'm so happy to see so many of our students. I'm going to read the first chapter of a novel I'm working on, actually, not one of my published books. It's 9 pages, and it's called Beautiful Girls Club, Shanghai. And this is chapter 1. The night the baby came, there was no electricity on Suzhou Creek. In the blacked-out embankment building, neighbors crowded the hallways in slippers, lighting candles, fanning themselves, and sipping tea from each other's kitchens. The elevator had stopped, and when Li Huan came home, she climbed 9 flights of concrete stairs, half enjoying the way her legs woke on the way up. It was late summer, and the city blistered and steamed. Outside, teenagers crowded pool tables, park benches, and the Bund. Even the breeze that lifted heavily off the water was hot. Motorcycles and scooters blazed down the streets, while tattoo artists at the mall just behind the embankment building inked people's arms, legs, chests, and backs. Li Huan's daughter, Sue, was watching her boyfriend's name, Chen Hao Hao, appear across her thin hip, never to be removed. She felt a shiver of excitement, almost indistinguishable from the pain. Her best friend, Ai Ke, sat next to her, holding her hand and giggling. Even after the needle had slipped in and begun its dark blue drip, Ai Ke kept saying, "Are you sure? How about my name instead? I'll never leave you." Sue laughed, thrilled to the needle, to Coco Love's high-pitched cover of Bad Romance blaring on the mall's loudspeakers, to the night unfolding luxuriously. Soon she'd be dancing with Chen Hao Hao, showing him the part of her that was now marked his. Outside Sue's apartment, her grandmother, May, sat with 3 friends chatting by candlelight about her daughter, Li Huan, who had almost reached them on the stairs. May was telling the story of Li Huan's triumphant creation of the name Xinba Ke for Starbucks, a story everyone had heard dozens of times and no one believed, although it was begrudgingly acknowledged that the agency where Li Huan worked had in fact represented Starbucks momentarily when the coffee chain first came to China. May's friends politely waited until she had gone inside to remind each other that the agency had also later lost the account. Li Huan crested the staircase holding her leather briefcase and a bottle of liquor she'd been given by a client. She had sunglasses on, even though it had been dark for 4 hours. As she greeted her mother's friends, she touched May's shoulder. "Ma, come to bed. It's after 11. May stood proudly, said goodnight, and followed Li Huan into the apartment. She lit the candle she'd been holding, and the room came dimly alive. Li Huan put her briefcase on the altar table, and May carried the cognac into the kitchen, set about making tea. They work you like an indentured servant. Li Huan sighed a sigh that had evolved for the primal purpose of responding to her mother, a puff of exhaustion with an affectionate half-laugh embedded in it. "They pay me, Ma," she said. She unbuttoned her jacket and shrugged out of it, heading toward the bedroom. May's voice followed her. "No money could be enough. They own your time. You should be with your family at night, not in that cold office eating he fan. It will ruin your health. I cook for you, but the food just sits. Where is Sue?" Li Huan took her time returning to the small living room, wearing a bathrobe with butterflies on it and carrying a book she couldn't have been intending to read. She acknowledged her mother's question only by glancing around in the dark, as if her teenage daughter might appear from behind a corner to spare Li Huan the criticism, which had become the hum of a song's refrain. Li Huan's look, too, was part of an ongoing performance. Their apartment was small enough that each woman knew the other's whereabouts and business. Sue wasn't sleeping, thinking, reading, cooking, dressing, showering, weeping. Privacy was not a possibility, and Li Huan understood that this was why Sue spent so little time at home these days. Of course the girl wasn't there. "She's with Ai Ke studying," Li Huan said. She did not say what they both knew she thought. So what if Sue had a little of her grandfather's rebel blood? Good for her. Maybe she'd be a revolutionary. Let her push back a bit. Why not? She was hardly doing drugs or committing crimes. Sue, of all the students at Nanyang Model High, was the one whom teachers were encouraging to apply for early acceptance into Shanghai Communications University. She had won the citywide mathematics competition only the year before. She wrote poems. How could anyone criticize her, or Li Huan's mothering, for that matter? Sue just wanted a little freedom to be with her friends, and Li Huan liked Sue's favorite, Ai Ke. She was a good girl, kind and sparkling, funny. As a child herself, Li Huan might as well have been model worker Lei Feng, the do-what-you're-told champion of the world. And she remembered, had carefully reminded herself since Sue was born, that she had been that way precisely so that her own daughter wouldn't have to be. Her child would have an actual childhood, would be spirited, an artist, dancer, activist, something huge and meaningful. She would not be an obedient shadow. Where this idea had originated, Li Huan wasn't certain. Perhaps her father had instilled it in her before he died. Or maybe her rebellious hope was cultivated by books she'd read, some of them forbidden to her, in the back room of the library where May had worked as an administrator. The book Li Huan had read most closely and repeatedly was a children's primer from America about a brother and sister who ran and jumped on neon lawns. Li Huan had always remembered the smooth skies, round-faced, round-eyed girl in pools, on swing sets, slides, merry-go-rounds. Her parents were calm and cheerful, immobilized on the pages, smiling wide. Even the spotted dog was carefree. She had brought those images to life when Sue was born, sending Sue and May to every playground in Shanghai, buying a puppy, lining up at water parks, and registering for gymboree classes so Sue could tumble on bright mats. So expensive, May had crowed. But she had dutifully taken the baby to each enrichment, finger-painted and swam with her, warmed bottles of imported formula, cared for the puppy, wrangled Sue into tights and tutus. Sue's childhood had looked enough like the book, but recreating the dully happy, sexless parents had been a more complex and difficult proposition. Only the absolute wreckage of Li Huan's marriage tempered May's ecstasy over her daughter's accomplishments, the title, director, the importance and responsibility, the fluent English. All that studying had paid off, May reminded the young people in their building, as well as Sue, who was studying English with their downstairs neighbor, a pregnant foreigner named Sophia. And the money Li Huan had managed to save, so much it gave May a flutter, enough for Sue to go to any college she wanted, any college, even one abroad. Of course, Sue was too young to travel yet, and as far as May was concerned, next year she would attend Shanghai Communications University, no doubt with a prestigious scholarship. That would prepare her for graduate study abroad, most likely at Harvard. In fact, May had repeated this plan often and widely enough that it had the cadence of a government mandate, a 5-year plan created by the Ninth Party Congress. May was infamous for Chueño blowing the cow so hyperbolically about her daughter and granddaughter that none of the other grandparents could compete, not even old Lee, whose son had become a doctor. Doc Lee took care of the building's residents for free, and yet May went on about Li Huan as if she was the only one of their children who had amounted to anything, not to mention the granddaughter, Sue. Anyone with 2 eyes could see that the girl was trouble. But May and Li Huan had blinders on about it, refused to see what she was up to. Sue and Ika arrived at Red Night Cave and obediently took their places at the end of a line outside the door. After 10 minutes, however, a bouncer scanning the line waved them toward the front. They grinned at each other and walked by those unchosen, paid 200 yuan, and found themselves inside a pulsing lobby, 3 levels of dance floors visible from the entrance, each with its own bar. The whole place was bathed in red and black light, and everywhere Sue looked, she saw glowing teeth. The white trim on her skirt had turned brilliant, as if lit from inside. She wished she'd worn white heels, or that Hao Hao's name was made of white ink. Ika pulled Sue to the closest bar, where within 5 minutes she was sliding the waistband of her skirt just low enough to show off her burning, swelling tattoo to a guy who bought them pink fizzing drinks. He was from Hangzhou, he said, romance capital, Westlake. I could row you around on a boat there. He raised his eyebrows, and Ika giggled, opened her mouth, and poured some of the pink liquid in. Sue rolled her eyes, looked around with increasing anxiety for Chen Hao Hao. Even as Ika tried to move Sue and the boy toward the dance floor, Sue kept a steady eye on the door. He should be there any minute. But finally, she gave in to Ika's pleading and followed her friend to the cluster of bodies, where Ika swung her hips and threw her arms in the air, clapped, laughed, leapt. Sue leaned back and forth distractedly until Ika and the romantic boy were locked in eye contact. Sue checked her phone. Nothing. She wiggled her way back toward the club's entrance and stood behind the bouncer. Outside on the hot street, the line of clubbers had doubled, and cars swerved up to the curb, delivering people before screeching away into the night. She scanned the line again. Was he waiting? She checked her phone. 2 missed calls from her grandmother, May. She went back inside and tried to dance, to drink, to enjoy this night, which she and Ika had been planning and waiting for forever. But now the club's central winding staircase felt like a hopeless climb nowhere. The dance floor, a stew of people who weren't Chen Hao Hao. The pain in her hip made Sue want to go home and slide into bed next to her grandmother. It was after midnight when the bouncer outside Red Night Cave saw the limousine pull up. He left his post momentarily to help escort 3 men who climbed out. 2 wore Western suits, and the third black pants so sleek they looked as if they had been airbrushed onto him, and a bright white shirt with a starched collar and clear buttons. His face was stacked on top of this outfit like a block, all jaw and teeth and strength. His hair appeared digitally rendered to match the pants, so shellacked that the streetlights glared off of it. Everything about him seemed unnaturally bright, exaggerated, precise, as if he had more than the 3 dimensions to which most pitiful humans are limited. He was smiling, happy to be where he was, with his friends, Zhang and Yuan, whom he followed toward the club's VIP entrance. He felt himself pitch toward the music, the beautiful women, the night. He waited eagerly for the pulse of the club to reach his ears, but heard sobbing. There was a girl leaning against a wall, crying like an animal. Her round friend trying to calm her by smoothing her hair down, but the crier was inconsolable. Yao stopped walking. Is she okay? He asked the friend. And at this, the crying girl looked up. Her whole being seemed drenched. She looked like a seal he'd seen at the aquarium once with his daughter. The creature had been poking its face above the surface of the water, soaked and innocent, everything about it slicked back, waiting. He looked right into the crying girl's eyes, the tears still pouring from them. It can't be that bad, he said. And she, to his lasting astonishment, shook her head at him and replied, don't patronize me just because you're old. His surprise was so great that he laughed a genuine laugh. Old, he asked. He laughed some more. Too old to buy you a drink and cheer you up? He was 42, and still he thought reasonably handsome. Yeah, what's holding us up? His friend Yuan called from where he and Zhang had stopped. I've come across a distressed guanyu, Yao said cheerfully, a damsel. Zhang laughed and doubled back toward Yao. Let's cheer her up, he said. A guanyu, the crying beauty repeated. Let me guess, you're going to save me? Her tears had stopped, and now she seemed to be preparing herself to do battle with him. He felt a surge of excitement, pure pleasure that started in his center and traveled out to his limbs. It reached his fingers, and he put two of them on the girl's chin, lifted it up so that she had to look into his eyes, which he was quite certain were still youthful and appealing. He said, come have a drink with an old man, and I'll try as hard as I can to save you. But first tell me your name. I'm Sue, she said. And this is my friend, Ai Ke. He left his fingers on Sue's face until her resolve melted. Maybe I can be your friend too, he said. And then he and Zhang led Sue and Ai Ke to the VIP room. Sue followed almost blindly. Unhappiness rendered her newly reckless, as if she had nothing to lose. Maybe Hao Hao would see her walking with this handsome stranger. Maybe it would make him feel the way Hao Hao's beautiful stranger had made her feel. But they arrived too quickly at the VIP room via a twist of black and red lights, blaring music and bodies. Sue had never been in a VIP room before and was surprised by its simplicity. It was less crowded, but otherwise not so superior to the regular space below, and she said so to Ai Ke when the two slipped away to the bathroom to put on lipstick. It doesn't have to be better, Ai Ke said. Being allowed to be in it is what's better. We're VIPs. She grinned delightedly. Fuck Chen Hao Hao and that skank. Let's go hang out with some real men. They returned to the table holding hands and were greeted by Yao, Zhang, Yuan, and a bottle of cognac that cost more money than either of them had ever seen spent on anything. Sue's mother, Li Huan, made money at the advertising firm, but she did not spend it on ostentatious drinks or jewels or much of anything. And Ai Ke's family had no money at all. Either in spite or because of this, Ai Ke lacked Sue's sense that gushing over the expenditure was shameful. To Sue's annoyance, Ai Ke let her mouth hang open when Zhang said, let me pour you some XO, it's 5,000 yuan a bottle. Sue looked away, feeling implicated by what she knew her mother would consider both his and Ai Ke's tackiness. She tried to set herself apart by looking bored when Zhang announced the price, and then by sipping slowly and with as much knowing scorn as she could muster. Yao watched her with a combination of amusement and curiosity. Have you recovered from your earlier heartbreak? Is it normal for humans to recover from heartbreak in under an hour? She asked. She felt hot and vague. He filled her glass again. I guess not, he said, oddly serious for a moment. He looked at her strangely and then seemed to snap back into a more composed, artificial state. But cocktails help, he said. You're an expert, I guess. On heartbreak? No. But I know some short-term cures, and drinking is one of them. She was so young, he thought, and so silly, but proud, too. She reminded him of Lena. Sue took another stinging sip, felt her head wobble, and put the glass down. She didn't want to be drunk, especially now that Chen Hao Hao wouldn't be there to sneak her back into her apartment, tackle her onto the couch, and then miraculously escape before the sun was up without waking her mother or grandmother. The thought of him in his socks tiptoeing out of her living room, both of them trying not to laugh, brought the drink up into her throat. She pushed it down with another sip. Dancing can help too, Yao said. Come try it out after you finish that. He led her to the separate dance floor in the VIP booth, from which the regular dance floor was visible below. Sue felt Yao's arms wrap around her and his hands rest on her hips. She wondered if anyone had ever fallen over the balcony and willed herself not to search the floor below for Chen Hao Hao. For a moment, she pushed away from Yao and he looked at her, interested. Is something wrong, he asked. I'm a serious person, she said. I have no doubt that's true. They both stood there for a moment and then he asked, does that mean you don't indulge in frivolities like dancing? No, she said, I do. She moved back into his arms and he danced slowly with her. She was a strange and funny girl, he thought. His phone began to vibrate, but he ignored the call. Sue inhaled the unfamiliar smell of Yao's aftershave and closed her eyes, tried to feel as little as possible, to vanish. But she felt more visible than she had ever felt, a sensation both thrilling and terrible. The spotlight that followed Yao shed extra glow onto her. Managers appeared to offer them cocktails, food, even a private room he turned down, leaving her to wonder what would have been in it. Drinks were placed into her hands until the room spun, and she gave in to the burn of Yao's attention, which from the moment she met him seemed both to keep her warm and to threaten her with a kind of danger she wasn't sure she could name. When Yao finally gave in and pulled the still buzzing phone from his pocket, Sue stopped dancing and watched him read the screen, his eyes first scrolling and then frozen. He looked monstrous in the phone's blue light. "Excuse me a moment," he said, and headed back to the table, where Zhang was also blue-lit reading his phone. Sue stood for a moment, not wanting to follow him, but then followed, deciding she would pay attention. May always told her when she was in a new situation she should watch and listen, learn and experience as much as she could, by observing. Only Yuan, the flavorless friend who had hardly spoken all night, seemed not to be in on whatever was happening. "Zamala, what's up?" he asked in his thick voice. "Mei shem shar, just a little accident," Yao said. "It's nothing." Sue looked around. She took his nothing and filed it away. Now that Chen Hao Hao was gone and she was here in the VIP room with an old man, what was an accident elsewhere but another scene in the newly unfamiliar movie of her life? When the club lights were all shut off simultaneously at 2, she and Yao were back on the dance floor. Everyone was thrown into blackness so complete it felt three-dimensional, textured, almost to Sue as if the dark would hold her up should she fall. She knew the rule. Chen Hao Hao had told her, when the lights went out, you kissed whoever you were with. Yao said, "Serious Sue," and then put his fingers back under her chin and tilted her head up toward him as he had in the entryway to the club. "Is it all right if I kiss you?" She nodded into his hand and then leaned back. He had just heard himself ask this girl for permission to kiss her and felt as much pleasure at the experience of having felt he should ask as he did at feeling her smooth, thin throat and her lips, which he kissed as softly as he could. Sue held still and let Yao kiss her, tried to make her mind clear, but it was flooded as if by way of her mouth, with the leather, alcohol, hard taste of him, so unlike Chen Hao Hao's Sprite and chewing gum. Sue herself tasted like chrysanthemum tea, clear, sharp, a flower opening up in boiling water. Nothing Yao had drunk in a long time had made him as thirsty.
That was hot. Thank you, John. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Will. I don't know if some of you guys end up in academia, you'll know that it really sucks when you don't like your colleagues. But I happen to both admire and like my colleagues, so I'm quite fortunate. So bright. I feel like a French fry on a buffet table. I should briefly explain to you that my novel takes place in Las Vegas and concerns an American police officer from Oakland, a man named Robert, who has been forced to come to the city to search for his ex-wife, a Vietnamese woman named Susie, who has mysteriously disappeared. They always mysteriously disappear, intentionally or unintentionally. And Robert is being forced to do this by Susie's new Vietnamese husband, a rather unsavory guy. So I'll be reading from chapter 8. It's about 10 pages. It's midway through the novel, and Robert has now been joined in his search by, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, but by Susie's daughter, whom she abandoned 20 years ago. And the daughter is named Mai, and she and Robert have just met for the first time. And the chapter begins with her driving them to a significant rendezvous. And during that drive, he remembers the night of his honeymoon with her mother. So it's chapter 8. As Mai drove us up Paradise Road, the Stratosphere Hotel looming in the distance, a giant alien scepter, I told her about her mother's most recent episode with Sonny. That's her new husband. 20 minutes was barely enough time to state the facts, let alone explain the truth of the matter, which after 10 years still felt as far away from me as ever. "She used to be like that with me," I said. Scared me shitless. I didn't know what to do half the time. "Jesus," she muttered, with a disbelieving chuckle and a shake of her head. "Woke up this morning thinking I'd meet my long-lost mother. Now I find out she's a thief and she's crazy." "Don't say that," I told her. "Your mother's not crazy." What she was, I could not say. The doctor, her physician actually, the only doctor she ever saw, called it acute depression. I would always think of it as a sadness she carried around like something she needed. Mai slowed down as we passed Flamingo Road. We started looking for the bar. It was frigid in the Jeep, but the sunlight warmed my cheek. It made me think of warmer days in the past when I'd go driving with Susie by the ocean. I was never the passenger with her. I drove us everywhere, even when we took her car. It was my role, and I insisted on it. And to some degree, she did too, though I know now that I drove because I simply didn't trust her to do it. Had we the time, I would have told Mai about my honeymoon with her mother. I would have told her about how we had gone to San Diego, a drive that took us an entire day, and how her mother got car sick and vomited several times onto the Pacific Coast Highway. It was July. Traffic was horrendous, and the car's air conditioning was weak and intermittently didn't work at all. Not to mention, I had forgotten the cooler with all the drinks and snacks she prepared. She spent most of the ride with her seat reclined, staring out the window at the ocean as the tape deck played her yowling Vietnamese ballads. San Diego was my idea. We could go to the zoo, eat authentic Mexican food, visit the beaches, and see Tijuana in the distance. She agreed, but seemed less than thrilled. I suspected a honeymoon in our living room would have suited her just fine. She had this irrational fear of leaving town and being unable to come home, of us somehow getting lost and never finding our way back. That's what she told me anyway. Even before I was old enough to understand my parents' arguments, my father used to tell me, usually after one of my mother's fits throwing dishes or books or whatever, that women lose control when they're afraid and that men lose control when they're in love. Naturally, I took all this on faith until I finally fell in love myself and realized, with some horror, that it was often no different than being afraid, and that my father had been simply confessing how little he loved my mother and how much it terrified her to know that. When we finally got to San Diego that evening, I decided to take Susie to an expensive and secluded seafood restaurant on the shore, a place I once took a girlfriend years ago. She was quiet throughout dinner. She still looked a little white, but was also, I knew, silently blaming me for everything that had gone wrong that day. I ordered all her favorite seafood, oysters, squid, lobster. I must have spent half a week's salary. She ate some bread and pasta, but barely touched anything else. So I let her sulk and stuffed myself, nearly finishing everything on my own. When the bill came, she got onto me for spending so much. I told her to calm the hell down, which was when she snapped and demanded that I drive us back home. I suggested she walk home if she wanted to, because I wasn't driving another goddamn mile. And that's when she flung her fork onto her plate, shot up, and stormed out of the restaurant, abandoning me to a restaurant full of curious glances. I hadn't yet paid the bill and had to toss my card on the table as I hurried after her. I'd had women do this to me before and was already rolling my eyes when I saw her marching alongside the dark, windy road that led away from the restaurant. The key was to let them cool off, to avoid forcing anything. So I followed, calmly calling after her, insisting that we should drive to the hotel and get some rest, that she'd feel much better after a night's sleep. She continued down the side of the road in silence until we had walked nearly half a mile. Finally, I decided to catch up, and I grabbed her arm, and she turned and looked through me, as though at something frightening behind me. "I want to go home," she muttered in a distracted voice and wrenched her arm away. "I need to go home." She kept repeating to herself as headlights from a passing car illuminated her dress and her petite figure yanked her shadow across the two-lane road. Even in that moment, I desired her. We had known each other for only 4 months then. I was humoring her not yet out of understanding, not yet out of exasperation or resentment or a lack of options. My love was still too new for me to see this as anything more than a problem I could always fix later, a nuisance that came with the territory. So I continued following her, hoping she'd just tire herself out. We could have easily been mistaken for a couple on an evening stroll along the shore, with her leading the way as the ocean waves mesmerized us and kept us silent. And in fact, they did. I was bone-tired from the drive and busting at the seams after eating so much, but the moonlit evening was breezy, and the rumbling waves were lulling me into a calm that I found more pleasant than anything we'd experienced that day. The road turned lonelier, just the ocean on our right and hills on our left, and very little light save the moon and a single dim street lamp every quarter mile. Susie veered away from the road, climbed casually over the guardrail. She approached the edge of a grassy cliff that overlooked the dark beach below us. I came up beside her. "What are you looking at?" She said nothing for a few moments. Then she took another step forward and pointed, almost sadly. I squinted and finally made out a solitary figure strolling alongside the water's edge. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. "Do you want to go down there?" I asked. "I'm sure we can find a path." "Yes," she murmured, but did not move. A moment later, in a wounded voice, she says, "I don't want to bother them. Maybe they want to be alone." She had a habit of referring to an individual in the plural, almost like it was rude to refer to anyone as only one person. "The beach is big enough for all three of us. I'm sure they won't mind." The figure began wading out into the water, dipping hands into the ocean. "Come on, let's go," I said. "I'll find the path for us." I tried to take her hand, but it was balled into a fist. "Why are you crying? Come on, it'll be nice down there. The water will do us good, and the sand." But she was shaking her head, her shoulders trembling a little now. She started backing away. "What is it now?" I tried to check the annoyance in my voice. "Come on, it'll be fun." "No," she replied, and climbed back over the guardrail as I moved toward her. "Well, then we should get back to the restaurant. I left my card there, you know." I was raising my voice again, a thing I would always have a problem controlling with her. But she was moving faster and farther away from me and still murmuring no to herself and shaking her head and crying in her muffled way. "Where the hell are you going?" I shouted after her. Before screaming out a moment later when I saw the lights of an approaching car, she was still rushing toward the road, and then her feet hit pavement, and she sprang back just as the car's headlights set her ablaze. And in an instant, the car swerved, screeching its tires, and crashed headfirst into the guardrail on the other side of the road. Susie stood there like she was lost. As I raced past her, she turned to me in horror, clarity returning to her eyes, and I knew she had come back to earth. I would confront that face many times again with both relief and anger, but at the moment I was much more concerned with whoever was in the car. It looked like an older man, his body slumped over the deployed airbag, face turned inward under a mop of strewn white hair. He had not been wearing his seatbelt. His car's front end was embedded in the gnarled guardrail, headlights doused, but I saw no smoke or sign of leakage. "Sir," I called through the half-open window, "can you hear me, sir? Are you okay? If you can hear me, don't move. Do not move any part of your body. We'll go get help." I ran to the passenger's side, reached in, and took the key from the ignition. It was still too dark to see his face or any blood. I felt his neck and found a pulse. My hope was that the impact of the airbag had only knocked him out. I remembered Susie and looked up, and she was standing on the other side of the car, peering in with frantic eyes. She said, "I killed them." "No, you didn't. But I have to call for help." We passed a gas station down the road. I rushed over to her. "Baby, I need you to stay here and watch him. Do not move him, understand? If he comes to, tell me he has to stay completely still. If the car starts smoking or anything, run away as fast as you can. Do you understand all that? Do you? I'll be back as soon as I can." She was startled out of her trance and started shaking her head at me. No, don't leave me," she pleaded quietly. "Someone has to watch him in case he comes to. I'm coming back, all right?" She took hold of my wrists and kept insisting I not leave, and finally had to wrest my arm away. "Stay, goddammit!" I thrust my finger at the motionless man. "I need you to stay. I'll be right back." Her arms fell, and she looked at once chastened and desperate. Before she could say anything else, I raced down the road. When I got to the gas station, it was still open, but no cars were out front, and I couldn't see the attendant at his counter. Instead of running inside to find him, I ran directly to the payphone. I gave the dispatcher the location of the accident, but when she asked me for more details, I pretended to have been a passerby in my car. Maybe I already sensed then what Susie would do. Maybe I was already acting out of shame. When the dispatcher asked me for a number and a name, I hung up and started racing back. The driver's body still had a pulse, but had not yet moved. Susie, on the other hand, was gone. I started calling out her name, screaming it at one point, despite knowing it would make her less likely to respond. She was probably as terrified of me now as she was of the accident she had caused. I'd never seen her look that way. I'd never seen her look at me that way. She might still, I thought, be in the throes of whatever emotion had seized her and thrown her out into the road. I knew I had to abandon the driver. Up the road, the grassy cliff beyond the guardrail dipped and a rocky path revealed itself. I scrambled down the slope, out of breath at that point, until I landed on sand and began running across the beach and again yelling for her. I soon heard sirens swarming in the distance, no doubt a fire engine, an ambulance, and the accompanying squad cars, all in case the accident was severe. They would probably block off the entire road. Unless we wanted to be questioned, we'd have to find another way back to the restaurant. By the time I made it down the length of the beach, my shoes were filled with sand and grating my feet, and I could see the glow of flashing emergency lights from above. I was hidden under a canopy of trees crowding the hillside, tramping through the sand and darkness. The beach was desolate. All I felt more than worry or exhaustion was this helpless rage at what Susie had done to me that day. In our first months together, she'd shown glimmers of how emotional she could get, slamming doors and cabinets and crying even at our silliest arguments. But she had not yet revealed this side of herself. I considered returning to the accident to explain everything and report Susie's disappearance, so perhaps then they could help me find her. But I'd also lied to the dispatcher, making the call anonymously, leaving the scene, and I wouldn't be able to explain all that away, not as an officer of the law myself. Knowing this just made the rage worse. The only option was to walk back in the direction of the restaurant and hope to find her on the way, and if not, I could go searching for her in my car. It took me nearly half an hour to find my way up onto the road, far enough away from the accident not to be noticed, and then back to the restaurant. Only a few cars were left in the parking lot, my Chrysler one of them. I saw a lone figure in the back seat. She was sitting still in the darkness, hugging her legs to her chest. She jumped when I opened the door. "What the hell were you thinking?" I hissed at her. She was peering up at me, stark-eyed, and shaking her head again like she was shivering. Don't let them arrest me. Don't let them take me. I told you to stay there, goddammit. Why'd you take off like that? I killed them. You didn't kill anyone, I snapped at her. She was tearing up again and trembling, pushing herself farther into the car. I took a long breath and went down on a knee. I softened my voice. "No one's going to arrest you. It was an accident. You didn't do anything wrong. I'm sure that man will be fine. He was just knocked out is all. Come here." I got into the back seat with her and closed the door. "Come on," I whispered, and put my arm around her. "Everything's okay." Her hot face pressed against my chest, and she curled into that space that had already become hers, like she was wrapping herself into the folds of a coat. I felt then the dampness of her dress and hair, the bits of sand on her arms, strewn also over the car seat. "You are sure?" she said, hugging me tightly now. "Yeah, he's fine." At that point, I was convincing myself of that, too. I could call the nearest hospital the next day and confirm it. The police and the medics are there, and they'll take care of him. Let's go to the hotel now and get some sleep, okay? "And the woman? What do you mean?" "The woman in the back. Is she okay?" "The woman," I repeated to myself. In the darkness, I could feel her staring into me, her breath warm against my chest. She looked like she's sleeping, but then she opened her eyes and she looked at me. The hair on my arms bristled and the darkness felt stifling. Again, I heard sirens wailing from afar, like she and I were in a cocoon and the world outside was burning. Had she hallucinated some phantom woman in the car? Or was I the one who'd gone crazy and somehow overlooked another human being in the back seat? But why would the woman sit in back and the man in front? Did I even glance once back there? I said, "I'm sure she'll be fine too. I promise you they're both fine." After we finally got to the hotel that night and showered together and then lay our wet heads down on our pillows, Susie fell instantly asleep and I lay there blinking at the ceiling, promising myself that I would call the hospitals in the morning. When I woke at dawn, she rolled over and embraced me and apologized for everything that had happened. We made love in the gray light. Afterwards, she wanted to describe the dream she had had that night. I braced for something terrible, for her to start crying as she recounted it. It turned out to be the one beautiful dream of hers that I know, of her living in a 3-story house drifting on the ocean. You could reach outside the many windows and caress the waves that lapped the walls day and night. Her entire family from Vietnam lived there with her, even those who had died. Everyone had their own room, her mother and father, her aunts, her uncles, her sisters and cousins, and every room was colorful and unique and connected to the others so that you could walk through them all like you were walking through a garden of rooms. Only years later, thinking back on this dream, did I wonder if I had a room in this house, or if I was even there at all. In the afternoon, we went to the beach and swam in the ocean and ate a lunch of grilled fish and oysters. I took her shopping afterwards and bought her a new dress. Then we saw a matinee showing of Dances with Wolves, which moved us both to tears. And in the evening, we had a delicious dinner at a Vietnamese restaurant downtown. We made love twice more that night, and she cried the final time. Perhaps I made myself forget, but I never picked up the phone that day. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our readers.